Hello, and welcome to the Essentials of Public Health Ethics portion of your course. My name is Cheryl McSweeney, and I am a family physician at Boston Medical Center and the East Boston Neighborhood Health Center. I'll be with you for the next couple of weeks as we work through ethics together. First, our objectives for today. We will describe the basis for modern medical ethics, including the relation to morality, religion, and law, as well as philosophy. Then define what is an ethical dilemma. And finally focus on 4 main ethical principles that we will later apply to guide our medical decision-making, as well as discuss their limitations. The overall format for these next 3 classes will be a pre-class talk on Blackboard similar to this one, so we can then spend most of our time in class actually working through clinical scenarios, getting practice applying these ethical principles, followed by some discussion of your findings and recommendations. And then we will conclude with discussing some actual clinical situations and how they were handled in real life. First, let's start with a definition of ethics. It's something we all probably have a concept of, but may be hard to define. It is basically a set of rules governing what is right and what is wrong. But some of those rules may differ based on context or source of the rules, your place in time or space. Culture, religion, and values can affect your concept of right and wrong. I think we would all say that killing is wrong, for example, and yet legally, we say not always. The death penalty is legal in many areas of this country, for example. Morally, you may believe otherwise, and ethically, we can debate. For our purposes in this class, we are focusing on medical ethics in clinical situations, where I would define ethics as a set of principles to guide medical decision-making. The principles we will discuss here today are there as a guide to help you work through challenging ethical dilemmas. They will not often tell you one right answer, but should lead you to the best possible outcome of the situation. There are many ways that people have tried to reason through difficult situations. Philosophy is one area of study that tackles this head-on. For those of you who may have taken a philosophy class in college, some of this will seem familiar. Ethics can be said to be a branch of philosophy, moral philosophy. Ethical theories, from some of those I have listed here, are relevant to medical ethics. For our purposes here, we will not dive into these specific theories, but discuss the most accepted basic principles of medical ethics, which are consistent with these theories. In thinking about how else we as people grapple with difficult issues, religion many times plays a major role. Certainly in Catholicism and in Jewish tradition, for example, there has been much work done in proposing frameworks for medical decision-making. Less formally, values also play a large role. These are our personal beliefs, maybe related to religion or experience, often strongly held. These are beliefs not based on principles, but still are what most of us use to guide us through our lives. There are also professional codes that we can turn to. As in many other professions, in medicine there is a code of conduct that we are expected to follow. The optional readings for Class 3 contain codes that are relevant to medicine, if you want to see what's contained there. I'd recommend taking a look at it at some point in your career, if not now. Perhaps the one most people think of first is the Hippocratic Oath from the 5th century BC. Have you ever read it? There's much of it that most people don't find relevant to our work today. While the updated modern codes are more helpful and certainly related to ethics, they are not as flexible as learning and working through the principles we will talk about today. So from all of these sources, our current concept of medical ethics has formed really only recently. The American Medical Association adopted their first National Code of Ethics in 1847. You learned in the research ethics class about the Helsinki Declaration and the Belmont Report, which helped to reform the practice of research. Although you also know from learning about the Tuskegee experiments that study continued until 1972. Additionally, there is the Declaration of Geneva, which, similar to the Nuremberg Code, was written in the wake of the trial of Nazi doctors for atrocities. It is a revision of the Hippocratic Oath by the World Medical Association, which continues to be adapted to modern times, most recently in 2006. The teaching of ethics in medical schools is even more recent. Just in the 1970s did it become prominent. Before then, it was something that you picked up or didn't pick up along the way. A survey of medical schools in 1972 showed that just 4% of schools had dedicated ethics curricula. Now all do. So looking at all these changes, something to remember is that this is fluid. Situations you encounter now might not have been possible years prior, due to advances in technology or changes in the culture. It continues to evolve over time, but the principles we'll discuss shortly remain valid. Part of their value is that you can use them to help reason through even novel situations. So why is this important to you? You really will use this daily, really. It may not be in big life or death situations every day, hopefully, but it will be often that you encounter problems where thinking ethically will be helpful. For example, the patient that comes into your office with a common cold, insisting on being prescribed antibiotics. You may know what is clinically indicated, but the question of what is best is an ethical one as well. Practicing reasoning through ethical dilemmas based on set principles ahead of time will make it easier when it comes up in reality. As physicians, we have a great privilege. You get to know the most intimate details and struggles of people's lives. With that level of trust comes a great responsibility to be careful, deliberate, and thoughtful about the decisions that we make in medicine. And if you need one more reason, it is on step 1, so you do need to know this to be successful there as well. So what is an ethical dilemma? It's a situation in which reasonable people, you and me, assuming we're reasonable, can disagree on what is the best course of action. There may be 2 or more options for how to resolve the dilemma, and it is often, at least initially, unclear which is best. There's very often not a right answer to a dilemma. By definition, they're difficult to resolve, and thus can often trigger strong emotion. Perhaps based on your own personal beliefs, we can often have a strong first reaction to a situation, maybe even feeling that we know what is best. But that's when it's most required of us to take a step back and try to reason through a case based on the principles we'll discuss today to ensure that we are acting in an ethical manner. So as we go through the cases in class, I'll ask you to remember this and try to respect the views and thoughts of everyone in your small group and in the larger class. We all come from different places, and that's part of the richness of the discussions that I hope you will have. The goal is to be able to think through a case and justify your reasoning based on principles. You may not all come up with the same answer, because as I said before, there's often not one right answer. But what we are looking for is what the best possible outcome is of the situation presented. So finally, on to the principles that we'll be discussing. They are beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and autonomy. And I'll talk about each of them individually. First, beneficence. From the root of the word, you know this is about doing good. It says that we are to act in the best interest of the patient. Sounds pretty simple, but like everything else, can sometimes get more complicated. For example, back to our patient who's requesting an antibiotic prescription for the common cold. Using this principle, and what we know is indicated clinically, we could say that it is in the best interest of the patient to receive only symptomatic treatment, like decongestants and medication for fever or pain, for example. But you could also make the argument that it is in the best interest of the patient to receive the antibiotics. He strongly feels it is necessary and that it will make him feel better. It may strengthen your relationship with the patient to be able to comply with their request. But is that okay? We can debate it. Another factor sometimes considered with this principle is more broadly, not just what is best for the patient, but what is good for society as a whole. You can see that at times those could conflict. Back to the antibiotics again. Is it okay to prescribe antibiotics that are not indicated because it may do some form of good for the patient? Or should we also be thinking about the good for the community and not contributing to the level of antibiotic resistance? Beneficence must also always be balanced with non-maleficence, which we'll talk about next. So, if beneficence is about doing good, non-maleficence is about not doing bad. Similar, but slightly different concepts. This is most commonly thought of as the first do no harm tenet of being a physician. In practice, it is often impossible to do no harm, though. Many treatments come with expected side effects. Surgeons must cut. Chemotherapy attacks more than cancer. In reality, balancing this principle with beneficence, this is more about risk versus benefit. You saw some of this in number form earlier, with number needed to treat, number needed to harm. Those are numerical expressions of this. As it plays out in practice, it may be less clear where the balance is, but our goal is certainly to not needlessly cause harm. In our antibiotic, for example, we would be thinking about possible harms caused by antibiotics. Could the patient have an allergic reaction to the medication or develop an intestinal infection like C. diff colitis from overuse of antibiotics? We may decide that these risks, however small, outweigh the request for an antibiotic that is not indicated clinically. If our patient had a bacterial pneumonia which required antibiotic treatment, then this balance would be different. Patient autonomy, or what the patient wants, of course, plays a part here. Patients can choose to accept varying levels of risks. We'll talk more about autonomy in a moment. First, justice. This principle relates to treating others fairly and equitably. It is expected that patients presenting to us with similar complaints will be treated similarly. In thinking about healthcare disparities, we know that this didn't and doesn't always happen. In healthcare, we also think about the concept of distributive justice. For better or worse, healthcare is a limited resource. Part of our duty as physicians is to think thoughtfully about how that resource should be distributed. Does everyone have a right to healthcare? If so, how much? The same for everyone? Or should it be based on a person's contribution to society, or on their need, or on some other method? If we have a limited antibiotic supply, who should qualify to receive it? We'll talk more about this, and we'll get to work through a case using this principle in our third class. And finally, the principle of autonomy. This concerns respect for persons. This is the concept that individuals have the right to make their own choices, especially with respect to their own bodies and health, providing they have decision-making capacity, which we'll talk more about in Class 2. Perhaps especially in our country, we highly value this concept. As physicians, respecting patient autonomy has certain requirements for us, including confidentiality, truth-telling, and keeping promises, to ensure that patients have all the information they need to be truly autonomous. Confidentiality you are likely all familiar with as a duty of the medical profession. This is respect for a patient's privacy. We cannot reveal a patient's medical information to anyone without the patient's permission. The legal side of this is HIPAA. Of course, patients can choose to waive this right, which they need to do in order for us to communicate with their insurance companies, who need to know what's going on in order to pay for it. We can also have them sign a release of information to be able to access prior records, for example. There are limits to confidentiality, though. For example, we are mandated reporters of abuse or neglect of those who may not be able to speak for themselves, such as children, elders, or disabled persons. If we have a suicidal or homicidal patient who is planning to cause harm to themselves or others, they can be hospitalized against their will. There are a number of communicable diseases that are required to be reported to the Department of Public Health. You can look at the list at this link here on the slide. It's quite a long list. And finally, there is the case of minors. Most minors are required to have parental consent to receive medical care. The exceptions are if a minor is declared to be a mature minor, understanding the nature and consequences of treatment, or is now or has been married, is a parent themselves, is in the armed forces, is living completely independently, or believes themselves to be pregnant, except in the case of abortion. This varies by state, but in Massachusetts, parental consent, or judicial bypass thereof, is required for abortion care. Autonomy also requires truth-telling. We must disclose medical information to patients and not deceive them. This includes revealing results, diagnoses, prognosis if known. In particular, this is important in informed consent, which you learned about prior. Being able to give consent requires being fully informed. For that, we need to be truthful in the information we provide to patients so they can best make a decision for themselves. It also requires us to disclose our errors. Mistakes are made every day in medicine. Just the sheer volume and complexity of information makes this pretty much inevitable. We work very hard to minimize errors, but you still will make some over the course of your career, most small, but perhaps some larger. When an error occurs, we know that patients want to know about it. They want to know how it happened, what is being done to prevent it in the future, and they want an apology. We know that if this is done well, it can be an important part of easing patient suffering. Respecting patient autonomy also requires us to keep promises. This is following through on commitments to patients. It can be as simple as calling with their lab results when you said you would. It's a part of professionalism as well, and builds trust in the doctor-patient relationship. and adds to a patient's ability to have all the information necessary for autonomous choice. So those are the 4 main principles that we will focus on. You may hear about other principles which are mostly offshoots of the 4 we have focused on. Utility is one, which we veered into a little bit in talking about beneficence. It is the concept of doing what is the greatest good and the least harm for all. Paternalism is a principle that limits autonomy. In medicine, it assumes that the physician knows what is best for the patient. While this may sound familiar from the days of Marcus Welby, it is not generally how we operate today. While you might be in a position of needing to substitute your judgment for that of a patient who lacks capacity, for example, in an emergency, we now generally strive to avoid paternalism in its strongest form, given the more highly held principle of having patients make autonomous choices where able. All right, well, thank you for making it through the slides today. Look forward to seeing all of you in class, where we will get a chance to work on applying these principles to cases of ethical dilemmas. If you have any questions about the material before then, please feel free to email. See you in class.